The passion, the energy, the power, the spirit of hardcore.
Hello everyone. My talk today is titled Hardcore Cypherpunk Values, and I want to give a quick introduction to the Riot Institute, where I'm the co-founder from. So we are an independent research institute working with methods of reverse engineering education and open source practices to empower people understanding the tech around them. So if you want to get in contact with us, you can drop an email. And a bit to explain of how we work as an institute. So we do a lot of small workshops and educational programs. They are not super public, so they are invite only. If you're interested in getting to know about these programs, you can essentially only contact us via email at this time. Topics that we're working with are embedded hardware security, open source practices around hardware, open sourcing hardware, and verifying all things around us. And I'm not only part of the Riot Institute, I'm also active in a lot of other institutions and organizations. If you're interested, there's currently the Open Hardware Month of the Open Source Hardware Association. It's a good starting point if you want to know about what open hardware is and what this whole movement is about. There are a few programs that will also happen from the Riot Institute this month. A good starting point is to go to ohf.oshwa.org. And we are also every year, together with the Chaos Computer Club, organizing also a larger group, so-called Habitat, at the annual Chaos Communication Congress, which will happen in Hamburg end of this year. This is usually organized together with the Monero community and with other people that follow our, that are having the same values that we have. And we also do publish a lot, so Riot Institute does publish a lot. You can here see some of our publications of the past years. I made them all available. If you scan this QR code, you will download all of our previous publications of the past years. And I want to almost jump into the talk. I want to briefly give you an overview of how to read my other talks that I've been giving. So I was here at exactly this stage during HCPP 2019, where I was talking about open and verifiable hardware and how we can use open source hardware to opt out of the existing system. I have been also talking this year at MoneroCon about decentralized commons and why I think it's important to rethink decentralization, why I think that decentralization is a process and is not a binary thing. It's like decentralized or not decentralized. You can rewatch most of those talks online. I would give you this type of orientation of previous and future talks that I'm giving. So this one is the second part. The first one I've been giving at the Proof of Work Summit. Some of the slides and some of the content I've introduced and moved over to this talk as well. I will be talking today about scaling tech, scaling values, and can we identify hardcore cypherpunk values? What are those hardcore cypherpunk values? And I want to present you also with a few cypherpunk tactics. So I structured the whole talk into these 4 segments. I will be talking about scaling and scaling tech versus scaling values, why this is an entirely different thing, and why it's important to understand that scaling is also a reductive process, a process of simplification. I want to revisit a few of the cypherpunk values. I think this is a bit of a tough thing to do because over time we have different phases of cypherpunk. So we'll present you with a way of how to read cypherpunk culture over time throughout the different scaling phases. And I want to make a point again, and I know I'm talking about this a lot, but I want to make the case for verifiable things. So ideally, as cypherpunks, we want our systems and our things around us to be verifiable. We want to not trust or verify. And this is always a hard process. This is extremely hard. And so we have to constantly revisit the technology around us. We have to also educate around those topics. And I want to present a few thoughts about how we can put all this kind of theory into practice. I want to illustrate a few cypherpunk tactics. So let's jump right into it. The first segment is called the Cypherpunk Dilemma. scaling tech versus scaling values. And the question I ask myself is, what does it even mean to scale values? Is this even possible to scale values? And I want to start though by somehow investigating scaling as an idea, or what is scaling actually? And scaling is, by its definition, always a simplification. It's always a way with a specific aim in order to improve a system or to make a system better in terms of like efficiency. And that's a reductive process. And if we look at scaling technology has a specific aim. So you want to optimize for something. You want to make a system faster. You want to make a system more efficient. And you need to identify what kind of values you can optimize in order to get to this aim, or to get to this goal of making a system scale. So usually it is also a simplification process of the existing practices, of existing elements that you identify, that in order to optimize, you can then make more efficient. And if you observe scaling, it's a tough thing, because usually over time, if we look at all sorts of descriptions about scaling, they are usually looking at things in the past. It's very tough to predict the future. And so scaling has been, there have been multiple attempts in trying to understand scaling from a technological perspective. And I want to give you an example of different, very well-known principles of scaling on the example of the semiconductor industry. So this one, for example, Dennard scaling is a very well-known way to describe how transistor performance scales with shrinking the size of transistors. This has been firstly found and postulated in the 70s. And as you see here also on the display on the graph, there is a certain time when this stopped being the case, so when it stopped working, what was not the case anymore. So it described in the 70s a certain kind of phenomenon, a certain observable phenomenon that was not true anymore in the beginning of the 2000s. And this one is maybe more common, Moore's law. Approximately, also it stops working at the same time, around the 2000s. Some people say, okay, maybe this is not really completely over. And what is interesting to me, looking at these kind of observations about scaling, is that they are always considered laws, although they're not more than just observations. And even here, Gordon Moore is saying that it was just a wild extrapolation. So it's not really a law, it's just an observation of a certain pattern. And here another example to make my point that those things only work very well for the past, but not for the future. Kuhne's law, which was postulated in 2010, was already not really applicable anymore in 2011. And so there are a lot of limits in this type of observations, obviously. And what's interesting to me in this context is that they are breaking down at approximately the same time. So that means we are either on a specific time of semiconductor industry developments, or it just doesn't work. So these laws are interesting to me, and I'm showing you this also because of a specific reason, because they documented, on the example of the semiconductor industry, centralization of the whole industry. So in a way, if an industry is so much based around scaling and everything works around scaling, you have to, you can see that these observations show, firstly, they work already in a kind of centralized fashion. The semiconductor industry is not easy to enter, so it's like not easy to create like new semiconductors, but it has shown us over time that the entry barrier even is higher now. It's like really tough to enter semiconductor production. And I want to make the point that scaling is always a process that risks centralization. So however you look at it, scaling is introducing centralization as a huge risk. And there are many other examples of scaling that introduced centralization, and I just want to here show you a few of them, all from the IT industry, most notably content delivery networks, cloud services, serverless computing, virtualization. There are many others as well. They are always introducing a new form of centralization. We have to actually be aware that this will be the case with a lot of technologies around us in the future as well. So scaling always introduces centralization. And it doesn't only promote centralization, it also has trade-offs. So every scaling process introduces trade-offs. So you have to get rid of a few parameters, of a few functions of values. You have to simplify, you have to generalize, you have to, in a way, get rid of a lot of diversity in the system if you scale. And here's maybe a very tangible example to make my point, which is the cloud, which I believe is a very tangible example to show how scaling, in a way, creates this centralization. So as the cloud was also introducing convenience to a lot of people, you don't have to run your own infrastructure anymore, somebody else takes care of that. It introduced one of the most fundamental centralization points of technology. And this is a big problem also, especially for decentralized systems. So if we look at recent numbers of how many Ethereum nodes are hosted in the cloud, it's a huge number. And I think that's not a good thing. It introduces a new attack vector, which is introduced through centralization. And here's another example of how time and how innovation also introduces centralization. On the example of Gmail, Gmail has a lot of users. It's really insane how many users of internet mail, of email are using Gmail. And we can argue that Gmail did to some extent solve the spam problem because of this high amount of users, and they could start specific machine learning technologies to identify spam. It introduced a huge centralization force in the decentralized nature of email. So while email as such is decentralized, these developments, software as a service, webmail, in this specific case, introduced a large force of centralization. And I would argue that those two elements are the biggest setbacks to cypherpunk culture and to us as cypherpunks. These are cloud and software as a service has actually introduced the largest form of centralization into our culture. But scaling can be also read as transformation. So you have some old set of systems before, then you have a new system after that. So the scaling is always a process of transformation, which is informed by simplification and by generalization. So you have to standardize a few things, and you have to make it's a very selective process where you select, okay, this thing will make it into the new system. These are the things that we can optimize. These are the things we cannot optimize for, or we don't want to optimize for. And I want to give you another example, which is not from the technological domain. So in this book, I can recommend you very much reading this book. It's called Seeing Like a State from James C. Scott from the 90s. And he's explaining how specific scaling strategies on the example of central planning of specific cities, or the introduction of new systems, of new standards, have been introducing new forms of centralization. So in this case, maybe to make my point and to make you understand a bit more what I'm talking about, one very good example is the introduction of the metric system after the French Revolution, where there was the standard of the metric system available everywhere. This has deleted and removed a lot of standard practices that would actually work with other measurement systems. A few services, systems, economies have been changing and had to transform because of this standardization. Another very well-known example of scaling problems has been postulated already in the 70s. So this is also a great book. I really love this book because I'm using this also to make a few different points. And if you have not read this one, it's really recommendable as well. It's from Frederick P. Brooks and called The Mythical Man Month, also from the 70s. And Brooks was arguing that teams cannot scale that easily, and especially he was pointing to specific elements and practices at IBM, but also at other software developers at this point. And the problem was that usually managers and the whole business would calculate with numbers in terms of man hours and man month, and a process and a complete project would always be represented with these type of numbers. So would actually try and abstract a complex project always with this representation of man-hours. And the problem is, this is not that easy because there's not, you don't have this, the people don't have the same kind of skills, people work differently. And the biggest problem that Frederick Brooks was outlining is that there's the communication overhead, which is absolutely not reflected in these man-hours. And that if you put more people into a team, if you scale a team, there's the communication problem, which is definitely not scaling linearly, but scaling exponentially. And so then he was pointing out and showing this on many examples that if a project is already late and you add a lot more manpower to it, manpower, man-hours, then you would even have that project deliver much later. So it doesn't really work. It's not easy to scale teams. And this is important because this also has sparked some revolution, some other thoughts, most notably the agile development revolution, which is not really that much of a revolution, but the idea here was to maybe be able to break this down into smaller amounts of people that can work together, that can solve a few things. But as we know, this didn't work out particularly great. So agile is said to be dead already. The implementation maybe didn't work. We don't know what is the exact problem, but still what we can take away from this is a history and a story about scaling. That scaling isn't that simple. Maybe scaling is really complex, more complex than we think. And the problem actually gets even bigger when we look at decentralized technology. So when we look at blockchains, when we look at Monero, Bitcoin, scaling is not only about making sure the specific timeline works, but you have to actually also uphold specific values such as trust. You have to make sure that the scaling doesn't only work from a technological perspective, but also has worked from a societal perspective or from a security perspective. So it gets exponentially harder to do scaling for decentralized systems. So the question is now, we talked a lot about, try to explain you a bit on a few historic examples, how scaling worked in tech, but how do values scale? Is this even possible to scale values? And I want to talk here about cypherpunk values, if we can identify those. I tried to do so. And if you look over time, cypherpunks have been active since, we can say, since the 70s. And they had a few core cypherpunk values. So one element was definitely private digital transactions, but also private digital communication, much more so, and to avoid government surveillance. Later on, and this is where it gets a bit fuzzy, a lot of broader cypherpunk values have been added over time, mostly because people have been targeted, or some things have happened, or some publications have been done. And so over time, the whole cypherpunk movement has added values to the broader aspect of what they were standing for, but the core values have remained. And I tried to pin it down a bit and structure it into 5 different phases of cypherpunk in order for us to investigate together, like what are the values and what kind of values have been present at a specific age of cypherpunk or a specific phase of cypherpunk. And I would actually separate those phases in the foundational era, which was the 70s to the 90s, which was before the internet, most notably informed through the availability of a few encryption algorithms, most notably the RSA encryption algorithm and the early cryptographic protocols which appeared. We can see here on the right-hand side always what was the public impact of those developments. So this one was the availability of people through that cryptographic, with that cryptographic revelations. So second phase is the internet expansion phase. This was largely informed also by the web, and the web was actually popularized, so people actually started to communicate also electronically much more. Email was getting really a thing. E-commerce started in the US. So also notable in this context is the Cypherpunk mailing list that was getting much more active at the release of PGP, which was super seminal for having this kind of secure communication also over email channels. So the wide access to privacy tools through PGP and through the internet was actually made possible in this phase. The third phase was more focused around decentralization and very much informed at and around the 9/11 attacks and the Patriot Act that also sparked mass surveillance, and people started to actually feel the necessity to increase budgets around surveillance. There was a shift also that we have seen towards financial decentralization from the cypherpunks. So Bitcoin was introduced in this time as well. So that was really seminal and actually started through 9/11 in my opinion. And then we can see phase 4, which was mainly informed by the leaks and availabilities of specific information about the surveillance phases before. Here most notably Snowden revelations, and we can actually track also public interest into cypherpunk tools by the rise of encrypted apps that started also to peak at this time. So all the communication tools we're using these days started to be popularized at this time. And I would say this phase stopped at 2020, which is the phase that we're in right now, which was heavily informed by COVID-19, which accelerated also digitalization throughout society. So people had to be at home, people were in this kind of a lockdown situation, they had to go online even if they didn't want to, so it forced a new amount of new users into the systems. And we feel a bit that this kind of phase is also informed by a resignation in terms of like anonymity. And I went through all that individual values over time and tried to also pin down how these values have changed over time. I want to give you here an example about privacy. So we see that privacy was a foundational value of the cypherpunks, and in the beginning, in the foundational era, privacy was one of these core values to protect individuals from government surveillance. Okay, in the beginning it was mainly the cypherpunks themselves that wanted to exchange information, but then later there was also the need to think about anonymous publication and how these things can be achieved with means of technology, with means of email in the beginning. There was very, very limited public awareness at this point about the cypherpunks. It was very much of a niche interest. At the first scaling phase, we can see in the internet expansion phase, most notably to the release of PGP, and the crypto wars was this kind of first push where the cypherpunks actually were perceived in a larger, at least US context and partially also international context, still in a very expert group of people, and the public sentiment was really still comparably low. In the third phase, the decentralization focus phase, we see, for example, the first public Tor version being released. And in a way, if we look at the public sentiment at this age, at this phase, we see that the general public accepted that they are surveilled because it gave them a sense of security. So it somehow went the complete wrong direction from the cypherpunks. So while the cypherpunks still were standing for the same values, the public was actually moving towards extended surveillance, and they thought, okay, it's a good thing because we want to make sure that terrorist attacks don't happen again. In the privacy resurgence phase, phase 4, there was a lot of outcry though. Because of the revelations from Snowden, it was made clear that there is extensive surveillance happening. So there was a bit of a shift that we can see. Also, the availability of specific encryption programs was there, so people started to use and started to think about being, wanting to be private. And in a way, in the last era, which is the one where we now, we see this kind of, we see this a bit normalized. So there's a normalization, still people feel insecure and people want to have security, but at the same time, privacy starts to rise. So people want to also be private. And we can go through all these individual values and attest if this is actually a goal from the cypherpunks that has been achieved or not. Just very briefly, so one of the values was also cryptography for the masses, the availability of cryptography. This is one of those goals that has been achieved, in my opinion. So we have a public availability of most of the cryptographic protocols. They are, like, to a large extent not closed source, so we can verify them. One big push was also Let's Encrypt, so we have HTTPS everywhere. This is like also one of those goals that has been definitely reached, in my opinion. I argue though that we have to be also careful because there are terms used to make people feel confident that they are communicating in a private and anonymous way, like the example of end-to-end encryption, which is kind of used very broadly. And even if we have end-to-end encrypted communication, doesn't mean this cannot be intercepted. Usually the devices are the problem. The devices that we're carrying around are the attack vectors. Decentralization was also one of those values that the cypherpunks were looking for. This is also a term that has been used so extensively that I don't even know where to start, but the problem is like decentralization is, in my opinion, a process. So it's not okay, we're decentralized, let's move on with our lives. We have to rethink decentralization more as a constant progress and constant process to evaluate decentralization around us. For anonymity, this is the biggest problem. Those goals of the cypherpunk has not been achieved at all. So anonymity has become very, very hard and much harder over the years. So this is also a problem where the values of the cypherpunks largely differ from the perception of the general public. So while the cypherpunks believe that anonymity is important, it's a really necessary element of a better society, the public feels threatened by anonymous communications, by anonymous services. So this is definitely one of those things where the cypherpunks and the general public diverge totally. Freedom of information, this also sounds like super important, but we are not really there. And the problem is not only if we look at whistleblowing and the problem is that a lot of things that should be made available to the general public are not made available, but also if we look at the systems around us, the main principle is security through obscurity. So there's not a lot of information available about the devices around us, and this poses still a significant threat to cypherpunk values. Autonomy and self-sovereignty is also not something that are necessarily relevant to the general public. I mean, the problem is also in this context, how would you enforce specific legal disputes in such a completely anonymous situation or with anonymous means in anonymous decentralized systems? So maybe this is a bit of the tougher ones how to achieve, although we have seen different protocols emerge that tackle this. This is one of the tougher values to tackle. And resistance to authority obviously doesn't really resonate well with the general public because states want to maintain their authority. So what's the dilemma here? So what kind of dilemmas can we identify from the values that I have here presented? I'm talking here about the cypherpunk perspective. Right? So cryptography is available. Is that enough? Can we say cypherpunk is over because we achieved general availability of cryptography? Or what can we now conclude from this? So I'm arguing that scaling of technological systems is already hard. Scaling of values, we don't really know where to start and if that's even possible, because there's like maybe different values that we've seen that do not scale well with becoming mainstream because they don't really overlap with the broader public perception, or they're like very niche, or people feel afraid that these things actually become not the norm. So we're somehow stuck in this situation that if cypherpunk should scale, how would it scale, or how can we scale this even further? And scaling tech has solutions, and we have seen that scaling tech works and is reductive. But if we scale values, do we have to reduce the message even more, or how would that work towards the values? We've also seen that anonymity is maybe compatible, and also specific out of the values are not that easy to implement in the broader scope and broader public interest. So maybe this is not something that we can achieve. Maybe we cannot really scale cypherpunk values. But I think while the values of the cypherpunks would also have to scale, because technology is scaling and availability of technology is given, it's a tough process. Maybe that we have just failed in embedding the values better into society. Maybe we didn't really communicate specific issues well enough. Maybe that's the starting point for us, where to embed or how to better embed cypherpunk values into society. One example that is always like appearing in this debate is the privacy versus convenience debate. So it's often said that you can just choose one. You can choose to have an either private or inconvenient system or convenience, and then it's maybe not so anonymous, not so private. I think that's largely true, but not exclusively true. So there's definitely other options and other directions we should actually stop that debate, because I think it's like a misleading debate. I think it's possible to have systems that people can use and that are convenient. It's just also maybe that we have to change not the tech, but to have to change our practices with the tech. And I think one aspect how we can start doing that is to empower individuals and empower smaller groups of people to get started with specific practices that actually then bring those values into the larger scope of the general public. So I want in the second part of the presentation talk about the trust dilemma. And this is a bit more pragmatic because we've seen how cypherpunks evolved over time, how the values have emerged. I've presented a few different ways of how to read the different phases of cypherpunk. So can we actually use these things? Can we make use of the practices and of the values of the cypherpunks? What is the limiting factor? And the problem that I see also is that we have to rethink devices and our use of technology around us in order to investigate those cypherpunk values and to constantly check and demand verifiability of devices, of protocols, of all things identity. And this is a tough process. I've been talking about this also during MoneroCon and some time ago also at HCPP 2019, where I was presenting a few different perspectives onto utilizing open systems, utilizing verifiable systems, and using open hardware to opt out of the existing system. But this is a process that doesn't, it's not an easy process, it's a hard process, and it's definitely not convenient. If you want to rewatch the presentation, link is here for you. And the problem that I have, like here 5 years later, looking at what I was proposing 5 years ago, we're still in the approximately same situation with devices around us. We're limited in actually upholding the cypherpunk values and really communicating these cypherpunk values with the devices around us because they are not really verifiable. Nothing is really verifiable. And I thought that these categories of challenges that present us as cypherpunks, that are presented to us, which are limiting this device verifiability or the system's verifiability around us. And I would distinguish between hardware, software, and supply chain and operational issues that we can observe. And I know many of you have heard this several times, so I will be quick with this topic, but we have, even if we would actually be able to produce our own hardware, the fabs are limiting factors. So there could be the potential of undetectable hardware vectors through started opened level hardware trojans. There's this paper that has been presented a few years ago. Still, the option persists. We cannot control this. It's never verifiable if there are some stealthy hardware hacks available in the boards and in the systems around us. This is becoming a global topic at the moment. I've seen some other recent papers that are also discussing this. But on a more pragmatic level of things we could theoretically spot, we have closed security modules around us. There is TEs, there's Intel ME problems, there are backdoors in the systems. And I would argue the problem is here, if we look at the central vulnerabilities database, for example, they have a backlog of around 2,000 reported incidents that have not been processed since a few months. The problem is there are a lot of vulnerabilities known that we don't know about. So we have to consider everything around us very hackable and very theoretically compromised. So on a more pragmatic perspective, if we are thinking about building our own sample of devices that would also be connected with general general modem infrastructure, like LTE modem, for example, we're facing the issue that there are no modem alternatives. That is like one modem manufacturer that produces most of the modems. They're producing almost uninspectable devices. It's really tough and taking a lot of time for researchers to reverse engineer those devices. We have firmware integrity problems with a lot of firmware that is proprietary on those devices. So the hardware side alone is already a big burden on being able to verify devices around us. But there are also software challenges, and they're also not so very well known. And the big problem that we're facing, for example, with utilizing open source systems, Linux, or some other open systems, there are a lot of binary blobs in those systems, which means like the producer, the manufacturer of those devices, making available binary firmware, binary programs to run in order to open up the functionality to those devices. So there could be a lot of shenanigans being put there. We cannot inspect those, and it's a big problem. That limits our verifiability of those devices. We have closed source hardware drivers as well. We have insecure compilers, so even if we want to reproduce our systems, the compilers could be compromised. There's so many attack vectors that we essentially, it feels a bit, probably it is overly, feels too much. It's like we have to take care of all those things if we want to make sure that we upkeep the Cypherpunk values. And encryption implementations, there's a lot of open source available. There are still a lot of standardized closed source encryptions available that we have to also trust to some extent. There is a very well-known paper from Bernstein and Dell about weak curves. So there can be all sorts of other shenanigans going on with encryption as well. And of course, there's a supply chain challenge. There are huge challenges about supply chains. So there could be specific supply chain attacks. There could be deceptions. So even if you can trust the manufacturers, if you can trust a specific vendor, who knows that not the last step or at some other point, the hardware that you're getting is compromised. There are also a lot of other attack vectors. So for example, a critical infrastructure around us, the biggest problem, and I've been talking about this several times, is the XC util spectre. This was a attack that was executed over 2 years towards the XC project, which is a compression library available in a lot of the Linux distributions, in a lot of systems around the world. And the problem there was that because the maintainers of the software were so burned out, there were like 2 people that were really happy to pass on a few of the things to the next generation of people that are happily maintaining specific things. In the end, it turned out that those were people that wanted to compromise the whole system, and we were really short before essentially having all our systems around the world compromised. So the problem is there's the big divide that I see around us. So we have a lot of critical infrastructure, critical software infrastructure being run by a few people that are underpaid. And maybe this explicitly joke about the project accuracy maintained in Nebraska that was the XC project. So what choices do we have then if we want to use or participate in communication, in electronic communications? Are we fucked, or can we use some of the systems around us? So our choice, because it's not really a choice, but in an ideal world, we'll have the choice between partially verifiable systems. Okay, we cannot verify the systems fully, so we don't use them. But the problem is fully verifiable systems don't exist. So we have to accept that you cannot completely verify a system. So it's always a calculation if you can trust the system well enough. There's no way that a system is fully verifiable. And this is exemplified through these 2 security models. So we have security through obscurity, which is essentially what limits us in making things verifiable and usable. So that means a specific provider of a certain service or infrastructure or whatever is only opening up the information about about internal use to the system to a selected few. And we would ideally have this open security or open source security model much more available, where we fully control the system. This is largely hardware is preventing us from doing that, but I have been showing that also software is not really there yet. So one good and deeper rabbit hole in this regards in verifiable systems is Bunny's talk from 36th fantastic talk, fantastic guy. You might want to watch his talk about the verifiable systems. I've been talking about this during MoneroCon as well. So Bunny's attempt is to make things also visually inspectable. So one aspect that we can, as cypherpunks, learn from that is that if we maybe use like all the production methods, like all the technology, all the hardware, we can visually inspect if there has been something happening. And this also introduces another way of how we can create secure systems, because maybe esoteric systems, or like all the systems it's like not really interesting to the attacker to compromise a system which only a niche of users uses. We could argue that if you compromise a core cypherpunk system, you would get access to a lot of cryptographic keys. But let's not enter this rabbit hole for now. I think this talk is really a good entry point into understanding of what we can do as hardware, as people building hardware, what are our limitations in providing systems that are open source. And Bunny's point also is that open hardware alone doesn't solve this whole problem. So this is a set of practices, and we have to, in the end, also think about how to educate around these topics, because there's so many attack vectors that I didn't even cover today. But then from time to time, I'm always finding projects where I'm like super impressed that the people pulled this off. So in this case, it's a very interesting project. It is called Libre SoC. So in this case, on the 180 nanometer node of TSMC, a group of people produced their own chips, which are interesting and completely open, also inspectable. So these are very interesting projects, and this always motivates me, because there is definitely, with a lot of effort, the possibility to create these open systems. So I want to here give a few pragmatic pointers how I read our current set of options that we have, and I want to distinguish here between softcore and hardcore cypherpunk devices. And the question, and maybe this is a bit more pragmatic if you are not into like building hardware, but asking yourself the question, what kind of devices can I use? What kind of devices can I recommend to other people? So, because that's still the problem. That's our biggest attack vector, the devices that we use to communicate. And so we can actually choose at this point. Sadly, that's the only thing we can do at this point, to use all the technology or to appropriate existing technology. This is the set of options that we have at this point. And so the general set of options is to use old systems such as Libre boot systems, where you have, like, for example, all the ThinkPads that where you can manually disable the management engine, and which you then can expect if some shenanigans are going on. You could, if you're like super hardcore, try and create some cryptographic extensions for the Mena 65 computer, or like get this going. It's you see that the option space is a bit limited. And then something in the domain of appropriating tech, that's getting like easier. A very simple example, what a lot of people are using already, is Graphene OS or Lineage, Calyx OS, and install this on newer devices, on the Google Pixel devices, although there could be, of course, specific other functions that are running on the hardware that you cannot really completely get rid of with this approach. So I separated here this always softcore approaches and hardcore approaches, because I want to make the point also that this kind of softcore approach is the only really convenient option to use all the systems and all the apps and whatnot that you want to use. The problem is, as soon as it gets to the hardcore domain, it gets like really, really complicated, and you have to develop a lot. And the problem is none of those tech is really 100% working. So essentially, the hardcore option here, if you want to actually go away from Graphene because you want to get away from this Google phones, you think that, okay, maybe there are other vectors that I can spot. The hardcore option would be to use a very old Samsung phone, install Replicant, which is an Android distribution that comes without binary blobs, and get your phone number via silent link. Make sure that to be as cypherpunk as it gets. The problem is Replicant really works on super old devices at this point, mostly 3G phones. That's a big problem because 3G networks are not available everywhere. And so one thing is you would have to get into modern firmware, in reverse engineering. So that's a bit tricky, but that's the cypherpunk hardcore way. Another example.
But Silent Link is available you can use this with graphene as well, right?
For sure, yeah. So Silent Link you could, for example, use now. You can pay with Monero and get your phone number. And eSIM, actually. And another example, an example of notebooks is, as I was mentioning before, there's the softcore approach where you're okay with core boot. You would actually get your own ThinkPad. You would install, run core boot, and you have, I don't know, NixOS and Linux running. That's sufficiently secure. So that's a softcore option. The hardcore option is then to go into like even older machines that you, when you replace the firmware with LibreBoot, or you enter this kind of newer ARM-based devices which are not completely reverse engineered yet. A very good starting point there is the MLK project. So they're producing open source hardware that is also visually appealing and very nicely designed. So that's the options we have as Cypherpunk today. When it comes to key signers, we can also use hardcore or softcore variants of those. So, of course, the debate was always about these secure elements, for example, that are present in most of the cryptographic signing devices, such as the ledger. Are these enough for cypherpunks? Do we believe that they are off track? Do we believe that this happens? So not so many people know that, but for example, Ledger Live is phoning home, so this is already an ecosystem where cypherpunks maybe don't want to be part of. Trezor has this kind of verifiability because you can look at the device and understand like what's going on there. Until recently, it didn't have a secure element. The newer Trezors introduce a secure element, and with that also the protection of theoretical backdoors or so. So the hardcore variant of that would be to get an old phone, install replicate, run like desolder everything that you don't want to have in this device, and run all your things on this device. And the even more hardcore option is to have a nice watch. So in this case, the sensor watch, where you can have the 2FA running. This is also, in my opinion, a really interesting project because it's very pragmatic. You can get this on crowd supply, and you can carry around the 2FA device always with you. It's really nice. Just make sure not to lose your watch. There is a 2FA watch face that comes with that. Of course, other people could, and we could develop a lot of other applications. That's why it's a bit limited from what it can do as an embedded device, but I think that's a very pragmatic but also very hardcore approach already. Yeah, talking about cypherpunk tactics, what does that only? How can we put this into practice? What are pragmatic ways of how to look at the values and how to encapsulate the values into concrete action? So I would, these are more suggestions. This is not like how we have to do it, but I want to suggest 3 different ways of how we can actually form tactics around our cypherpunk values. These are based around education, infrastructure autonomy, and obfuscation as a method. And I want to start briefly explaining each one. So I think the biggest problem and the biggest divide that hopefully I've shown you that is happening these days is there's a divide between public interest and cypherpunk interest. And I think that's only because a lot of the problems around us are not known to the general public. So cypherpunks, and we here are experts in the individual domains, and we have to make those issues an issue of more people. We have seen this also in the value shifts of the cypherpunks. So as soon as there was a certain leak happening, Snowden in this case, people were becoming aware of their privacy. So we have to make those values and those issues that we have heard. And software cypherpunk tech is a good gateway to get people thinking about the problems with the devices they have, because it will be inconvenient for them to use this a little bit as compared to the software and hardware that is around there. And this gets them thinking, why is this so hard? Why do I have to think about those things? And then slowly we can drag them into the hardcore cypherpunk domains to hopefully help them help in reverse engineering or other things, because we need more people using these steps in order to counter these issues. Then there's infrastructure autonomy. This is also easy to do. If you remember, like at the beginning of the 2000s, there were a lot of like free email services around, all sorts of like people running down servers. You would be able to join specific NGOs that will give you the email address. This is not the case anymore. Nobody runs infrastructure. Infrastructure running is really hard. But then also it's not that hard. There's the self-hosting movement. There is a lot of people that start to host services, make them available to others. This is one very, very pragmatic and very simple option of somehow breaking this dominance of cloud and centralized ecosystems. Also to run nodes. It's like very easy to run Monero node. It's easy to run a Tor relay or bridge. Maybe you should know what you're getting into when you do that, but talk to friends and people who know what they're doing. Run an Namecoin node, run some other services that you want to support. This is really easy to do, and everyone can do this still from home. But we are somehow in an age where people don't seem to think that this is necessary anymore, but a lot of the systems would need participation. And then finally, the tactic of obfuscation. So I think the problem is also if a certain very tiny amount of people is using a specific tag, we have a huge problem because through the usage patterns of this tag, these people are also at risk. So to give you just a bit of context, in Austria, where I'm from, there's not a lot of people using Tor, so you can easily spot through the use of the internet if they're running Tor or not, and that's a problem. We need to make sure that people can hide in participation, that we have, because of that reason, to use and make available these systems to a lot of more people, so it doesn't become a problem for people to enter or use specific services. So it has to be, we have to get a wider application of this tag. And one way of how we can also create a larger buffer for people doing serious things, such as journalists, we shouldn't be deploying obfuscation methods. There's a very nice book about that by Tim Bratton and Nissenbaum discussing obfuscation as a kind of a civil resistance. And so this is something we have to think of. So how can we create noise in the systems? How can we create more transactions, for example, at specific services and specific infrastructures? How can we pollute the data collection? How can we actually counter the algorithms? So that's a very pragmatic approach here. Read the book, very recommendable. So in conclusion, I was talking a lot about Cypherpunk values, and they posed the question if we can scale them. But the problem that holds us back is technological literacy. We need to educate people about our values, about our things that matter to us. And the values didn't really scale in the same fashion as the tag did, that's for sure. So we have to also rethink, okay, are the values appropriate? Do we want to postulate a few of those values? Do we want to discuss them? Do we want to make them publicly discussed and publicly debated? And while Cypherpunk's emphasis always was on strong encryption, as we've also seen, a lot of these things are available these days. We have just to make sure that this is also evenly distributed, if people know how to use it. Another thing is that being a cypherpunk is inconvenient. I've shown you that being a hardcore cypherpunk is even more inconvenient, but we need to start somewhere. And we need to get other people also in this, not in the comfort zone, but in the inconvenience zone. So drag more people in the inconvenience zone. And we need to build and establish new anonymous communication networks, which also takes time, but these are not existent. And this is something that the cypherpunks were fighting for. We need to build those somehow. And cypherpunk pragmatically means also starting to use open source extensively, but also understanding the limitations of open source and making sure that you educate others, make specific systems that you find good, educate others, give those informations also to other people, and in order, ideally, to embed cypherpunk values into the broader society. Thank you very much.
I think you asked a key question, and that key question at the end is if we should even continue calling it cypherpunk. If we were to call it cypherpunk, then we're kind of establishing a second future in the house by leaving the crypto anarchist moniker behind us as an interesting experience that we're drawing from. all of us. Can you maybe postulate forward?
Cypherpunk with
Cypherpunk.
Impossible.
That Cypherpunk, the Cypherpunk of the network state, right? I mean, sure, we'll be cipher stands. Okay. Maybe looking at those core values and looking at the current landscape, without using any of those core values, do you have any additional words for Cypherpunk?
Yes, I think we were talking about this before, Michael. I think one aspect that I hopefully have communicated here is that education is key. So we need to somehow, and it's not impossible to formulate those issues that we have as cypherpunks, not cypherpoppers.
Sounds like a pill in a rave, right? Maybe some Cypherpunk. Once you Cypherpunk, you don't stop.
Exactly. Yes, I think educating and getting to know the devices around us is where it starts. I think I've made this point also in another talk. I forget what it was. It was like maybe 3 years ago or so. There is a lot of evidence that throughout the development of specific technologies around us, and Jonathan Cypherpunk wrote a wonderful book and making the point that we are getting tethered to all these different ecosystems and networks, and that's one of the practices of how these specific app and hardware providers are getting us hooked on their systems. So ideally we find a way of how to break open these kind of issues and this tethering to these devices. So Cypherpunk was giving the example always with the Apple iPhone. You cannot replace the battery anymore. So to regain this kind of agency over the technology around us, I think that's important to me. And I think that's something that's easy to communicate to others as well, because people feel threatened and feel the loss of control with the hardware around them. And if this is something we can actually give back, that's great. That's a great experience. It was, for me at least, a very good experience.
So I agree with that, but the question I keep asking myself this year at the conference is, are we communicating to the right stakeholder groups?
Maybe not. This is why Cypherpunk has so much potential, actually, as we can maybe reach the wider population. You guys know this is a joke, right?
Yeah. So no, maybe it's not a joke, you know?
Okay.
Punk's not dead. Pop's not dead. It's that punk, what's going on? So I want to unpack that last point, because a number of speakers here have recognized that the cypherpunk chase towards mass market and mass adoption backed by this capital that we've created is pretty much been a failed experiment. And well, I mean, if you were to look at it at a deeper sense, it's allowed us a lot of experimentation experience to gather. Should we not be looking at educating the public at large, because it's an incredibly diverse group? Should we be educating device manufacturers, technologists, VCs in this space?
Well, it's a very interesting question. So I think to convince the VCs would be very tough. And I'm not sure if this is something we want to do, but maybe we do. Generally, I think what we can observe from how I interpret your question is also that don't we actually still have the same values looking at crypto in terms of cryptocurrency? So if people make a lot of money, what I personally observe is that people somehow also get a bit more flexible when it comes to their values. And so that's a problem. So we have to somehow identify those people who stand true to their values and that we want to work with. I think educating the public would actually initially mean that we have to know or to a bit have a core set of values that we want to educate about. So I think it's maybe also not something where we need collective action such as Cypherpunk, but maybe we can do this in smaller groups. And I think if experts would be starting to educate themselves in the beginning. That's enough, and I think it's already happening.
So then, it'll be my last question because we're getting over time. I'm sorry I won't be able to open up to the audience. Is that going to be okay? Do we need to educate ourselves more internally?
Yeah,
Have we had enough cross-disciplinary contact with each other?
for sure. The problem is the security into obscurity model. So there's a lot of information out there that people are not allowed to speak about, or people don't speak about, or people just don't know. So there is a lot of things that we have to learn still in order to be able to reverse engineer the protocols. We can just reverse engineer the things where we don't get information about. And reverse engineering is a long process. It's a very long process.
Matthias Tarasiewicz from React. Good luck. Paralelní Polis, and hopefully also second future.
Thank you.
But